Hello everybody, thank you for joining us and welcome to the ASTRO 3D ECS Astronomer in Australia seminar series. My name is Dr. Jeffrey Simpson and I'm a postdoc at the University of New South Wales, and my co-chair is Anisha Hashan, also from the University of New South Wales in Sydney. Before we begin, it's important for us to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were Australia's first astronomers, and we acknowledge their long-standing systems of knowledge on which we continue to build. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, of the unceded lands on which we're meeting today. I'm speaking with you today from the land of the Wallumedegal clan, and my co-chair Anisha and our second speaker, John Lopez, are joining us from the land of the Bedigal people. Our first speaker, Lara Cullinane, is speaking from Ngunnawal country. We pay respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all First Peoples joining us here today. So why are we here today? This is a series of seminars facilitated by ASTRO 3D, the ARC Centre of Excellence for All-Sky Astrophysics 3 Dimensions. COVID-19 has affected our ability to travel and present at international seminars in 2020 and 2021. This is especially difficult for us in Australia because the time zone differences mean that although meetings are virtual, they often are run at 2 or 3 in the morning in our time zone. And so this lack of opportunity to network and present our research from Australia could severely disadvantage junior astronomers who are entering the job market. So we have 2 talks over this hour. Each talk will be 20 minutes in length with 5 minutes for questions at the end of each talk. Please save your questions until the end of each talk. Feel free to use the chat function to ask your questions if you prefer, and Anisha can read them out for the presenter. These talks have been recorded and will be placed on the ASTRO 3D YouTube channel for educational and scientific purposes. By being here today, you are agreeing to abide by ASTRO 3D's meeting code of conduct. And I've also already warned the speakers of this, but because of the limitations of Zoom, I will need to interrupt each with about 5 minutes left to let them know they've got 5 minutes left. On to our first speaker. Our first speaker is Lara Cullinane, a final year PhD student at the Research School of Astronomy and Astrophysics at the Australian National University, specializing in near-field cosmology. Her current work focuses on the Magellanic Clouds, in particular tracing their interaction history and effects on the local universe. So Lara, the screen is yours.
So yes, as you've heard, I'm Lara. I'm a PhD student at ANU, and today I'll be giving you a brief overview of the Magellanic Edges Survey, or MAGES, and how I'm using this to study stellar substructures in the outskirts of the Magellanic Clouds. So let me start with a brief introduction to the clouds themselves. The large and small Magellanic Clouds, or LMC and SMC, are the 2 most massive and amongst the nearest satellite galaxies of the Milky Way. And it turns out this makes them critical to all sorts of astrophysical problems. In the context of near-field cosmology, which as Jeffrey mentioned is something I'm interested in, the clouds have a significant impact on the Milky Way itself, influencing things like the shape of its dark matter halo, the orbits of stellar streams, as well as the distribution of ultra-faint satellites, several of which the LMC in particular probably brought with it when it was accreted by the Milky Way. Further, the clouds are the closest pair of interacting dwarf galaxies to us. The LMC is only 50 kiloparsec away, and the SMC is only 60 kiloparsec away. Their proximity gives us a unique opportunity to study their interactions in great detail, which we can then use to inform studies of more distant systems. So that's why we're interested in studying the clouds and their interactions. And the best place to study these interactions is in their stellar outskirts. That's because stars here are only relatively weakly bound and can therefore be more easily perturbed. And because dynamical timescales in the large galactic-centric radii of the outskirts are long, that means signatures of perturbation can persist for many gig-years. That's particularly evident when we look at recent panoramic maps of the outskirts of the clouds made using deep photometry and Gaia astrometry, as I've shown on the right here. This map shows the density of red clump and red giant branch stars, selected from CNDs like that you see on the left. The key takeaway here is that the outskirts of both clouds are very highly substructured. You can see there are arm-like features to the north and south of the LMC and a whole pile of just diffuse substructure all around both clouds. And all of this is likely the product of interactions between the clouds themselves. So then, in order to study these substructures and constrain their origin, during my PhD, I've led and developed the Magellanic Edges Survey, the MAGES. MAGES is a spectroscopic survey of red clump and red giant branch stars that specifically targets these stellar features in the Magellanic periphery. The survey itself uses 2DF and AE Omega, which is a multi-fiber dual beam spectrograph on the 3.9 meter Anglo-Australian Telescope at Siding Spring Observatory in Coonabarabran, Australia. And using this setup, we've observed 29 fields to date, which I've shown in red here, with each field containing up to 350 individual Magellanic stars. In total, that gives us line of sight velocities, and in combination with Gaia, full 3D kinematics for over 8,500 individual stars. And this is a truly unique data set that's hugely informative in tracing interactions between the clouds. Now, there's a lot of really interesting science that we're doing with MAGES data, but in the interest of time today, I'm just going to focus on our investigation into one substructure, which is this long arm-like feature to the north of the LMC. Now, there are 7 MAGES fields along the feature, but unfortunately, in this field, there are no convincingly Magellanic stars. That's because we observed this field pre-Gaia DR2, and the combination of a lack of astrometric selection priors in our target selection process, in combination with the inherently low stellar density of the field, mean that unluckily we just don't select any Magellanic stars here. So then our analysis is restricted to 6 fields along the arm, as well as the field in the nearby northern disk, which is located at the apparent base of the arm, as you see here. So then the first thing we do is to look at the metallicity profile along the arm. Now, I mentioned MAGES is a spectroscopic survey, and so by measuring the equivalent width of the near-infrared calcium triplet, which is covered by MAGES spectra, we can then use well-established correlations to estimate F(H) values for our stars. So I've shown here the resulting metallicity measurements along the arm, as well as for that adjacent LMC disk field on the left. The square purple points represent the mean F(H) values for each field, which we derive from stacking red clump spectra across the field, while the magenta triangles represent metallicities for individual bright RGB stars in the 2 fields where we observe these. And we do find there is a potentially very mild metallicity gradient towards metal poor stars along the arm, but this trend is barely statistically significant. In general, though, the mean F(H) values along the arm are all around -1, which is in fact consistent with isolated literature measurements in the outer LMC disk. So then we next look at the photometric properties of the red clump along the arm. Since the red clump is a standardizable candle, provided that, as we saw in the last slide, the stellar populations along the arm are all roughly consistent, then we can use the magnitude of the red clump as a proxy for distance. Now, because the MAGES fields themselves are actually only sparsely located along the arm, as well as have a hard magnitude cut at G of 19, which could in fact potentially bias the red clump magnitudes we're deriving, we instead turn to Gaia EDR3 for this. We select red clump stars from DRED and Gaia data along the length of the arm within a proper motion selection box that follows the proper motions we actually measure in our individual MAGES fields. We then calculate the median G0 magnitude within several radial bins along the arm, which are the purple points that I've shown. And then I've compared these observed magnitudes to those predicted, assuming that the arm follows the inclined LMC disk plane in gray. And you see these are consistent within uncertainty, indicating that the arm does in fact lie within the disk plane. And this fact, in combination with the similar metallicities found along the arm and in the nearby northern disk of the LMC, mean we can conclude that the arm is in fact comprised of LMC disk debris, and is not, for example, the disrupted remains of a lower mass satellite. So then, motivated by this, we convert the observed kinematics along the arm into the frame of the LMC disk, calculating the azimuthal velocity, v theta, which describes rotation in the disk plane, with positive values indicating clockwise rotation, which is the direction the LMC rotates, the radial velocity, vr, with positive values indicating motion radially outward from the LMC center in the plane of the disk, and the vertical velocity, vz, with positive values indicating motion perpendicular to the disk plane in the direction that we define as in front of the LMC disk, which is predominantly towards us. Then we also calculate the velocity dispersion in each of these components in the bottom row. So here I've shown kinematics along the arm in orange, with the magenta point at the left in each plot, representing the kinematics of that disk field immediately adjacent to the base of the arm. And our predictions for an undisturbed equilibrium disk are in gray. So the first thing you'll notice here is that, with the exception of this field, the azimuthal velocities along the arm are all consistent with the ones we expect in the disk. So this one outlying field you see is because this field only has 13 Magellanic stars, which is significantly fewer than all of our other fields. And that actually makes it really difficult to robustly differentiate these from Milky Way contaminants. That's also, incidentally, why the velocity dispersions in this field are quite elevated. So the takeaway is, don't place too much stock in the kinematics of that particular field. We do see, though, that there is actually a genuine large radial velocity dispersion in the fields near the base of the arm and the nearby northern disk, while the other velocity dispersion components are all typically equal to or less than 25 kilometers a second, which is similar to what we'd expect for an undisturbed disk. But most interesting for our purposes here is that both the radial and vertical velocities display clear kinematic trends along the arm, which are very different to those predicted for an equilibrium disk. You see the vertical velocity here increases along the length of the arm from around 10 kilometers per second to 30 kilometers per second in our most distant fields, while the radial velocity is actually pretty strongly negative all along the arm at around negative 40 kilometers a second. So then, in order to understand what can actually produce these kinematic signatures, we compare our measurements to a new suite of dynamical models of the Magellanic system, which I've developed in conjunction with my collaborator, Dennis Apple. I've included some relevant details of the models on the left if you're interested, but in brief, the LMC is modeled as a collection of test particles within a disk and halo potential, which undergoes infall to the Milky Way potential, along with the SMC potential, for 1 gig-year to reach its present-day location. We actually run several model setups where we vary the masses of the LMC, SMC, and Milky Way to see what effects changing these have. And within each setup, we actually run multiple individual model realizations where we sample from within the uncertainties on the current day locations, as well as systemic velocities of both clouds. Now, I will stress here that the aim of these really quite simple models is primarily to see what can potentially affect the northern arm, as well as other observed structures, and not necessarily to precisely reproduce their kinematics, as that would require much more detailed models than these ones. But despite being simple, these models are useful as a first exploration of what is actually a large and very complex parameter space. So in any case, to start, we compare the predicted kinematics of our models to our observations along the arm, as I've shown in this plot here. So for each model setup, the dot represents what we'd say is the median model realization for that setup, and the error bars represent the full range of model kinematics that are possible across all realizations for that setup. You'll see I've omitted from this plot the model setups where we vary the LMC and Milky Way masses, because these really just aren't significantly different from the ones I have included. So we actually find that none of our model setups can replicate the very strongly negative radial velocity we observe along the arm. And in fact, the model that comes closest is the no SMC model, which at least has consistently negative radial velocities, even though these aren't nearly as strong as what we actually observe. And we also find none of our model setups replicate this very large radial velocity dispersion in the innermost arm field and the nearby disk. But we do find that each model setup qualitatively, if not quantitatively, represents the observed increase in vertical velocity along the arm. So what does that tell us? Well, we can actually understand the positive vertical velocity as a result of the LMC's infall to the Milky Way potential. As I've shown in this pretty rough schematic on the left, the LMC is basically coming in underneath the Milky Way disk plane. And so the gravitational force of the Milky Way is in a direction that's predominantly upwards, which is positive, or mostly at least in the positive Z direction. And since the strength of the Milky Way's gravitational force relative to that of the LMC is strongest at large LMC galactocentric radii, we expect the vertical velocity then to increase along the length of the arm, as we observe. We actually see a secondary confirmation of this when we look at the out-of-plane distance, Z, of each field in the models, as I've shown on the right. Like the vertical velocity we see for all of the model setups, this becomes increasingly positive along the length of the arm, as you'd expect from the effect of the Milky Way. Unfortunately, though, our red clump distance estimates aren't quite precise enough to actually detect trends of this magnitude observationally, yet at least. So then, the other thing we can take away from our models is that they also suggest that recent interactions with the SMC likely do not significantly affect the formation of the northern arm. So there are two close interactions with the SMC that occur within the 1 gig year we run our models, which I've shown schematically on the left. The most recent of these is an SMC pericentric passage around the LMC about 150 million years ago, which we actually already knew about from literature studies of SMC kinematics. However, we find that this pericenter is so recent, and also that it occurs at such a large out-of-plane distance, that it actually only closely affects very nearby stars in the southwestern LMC. So they just don't have enough time to be perturbed and then rotate all the way around the disk to form the northern arm. Probably more interesting, though, is that we find in many of our models a new SMC crossing of the LMC disk plane around 400 million years ago, where the SMC is crossing from in front of the disk plane to behind it, which is basically where it is today. However, we actually find that the stars closely affected by that disk crossing are not the ones that today form the northern arm. So I've shown on the right to demonstrate this one very typical model realization as it appears today, with each point color-coded by its distance from the SMC at the time of that disk crossing 400 million years ago. And you can see that stars which today form the northern arm, which is along here, are all colored yellow, so not closely affected by the disk crossing. And this fact, along with the fact that these models just don't replicate the negative radial velocities observed, imply that this particular interaction is probably not the origin of the northern arm, though it actually might well affect stars in the western outskirts of the LMC. That's some future work, so stay tuned for that. So then, if it's not this disk crossing, what can produce the negative radial velocities that we observe? Well, our hypothesis is that these are potentially the result of even earlier interactions with the SMC. If we actually rewind our models for longer than the 1 gig year we traditionally run these for, we find there are potential close interactions with the SMC, both pericenters and disk crossings, although I'll stress that the specifics of exactly when and at what distances these occur are very, very uncertain due to the very simplistic nature of our models. But if we do again color code the current model points by their distance to the SMC at the time of one of these early interactions, we do indeed find that it can closely impact stars here in this dark purple region near the northern arm today. And this indicates it is at least plausible then that these earlier interactions with the SMC have in fact contributed to the formation of the northern arm, though we will need more detailed models, particularly n-body models, which incorporate self-gravity, to actually tightly constrain these early interactions between the clouds and confirm our hypothesis. So then, overall, our current suggestion for the formation of the northern arm is that these early interactions with the SMC, is that 5 minutes?
Yes.
No worries. So our early interactions with the SMC begin to shape the northern arm, including generating its very strongly negative in-plane radial velocity, which our models don't replicate. Then with the final shape in kinematics in the Z direction along the arm, the result of the LMC's infall to the Milky Way potential over the past gig year, with it not actually being strongly affected by recent SMC interactions. So then, on that note, I will conclude and leave you with a brief summary of what I've discussed. I've introduced you to the Magellanic Edges Survey, which is a spectroscopic survey of red clump and red giant branch stars across the Magellanic periphery. We've observed over 8,500 stars across 29 fields to date, for which we now have, in combination with Gaia astrometry, full 3D kinematics. Using this data, we first investigated an arm-like substructure to the north of the LMC. We find that this structure lies in the LMC disk plane and is comprised of disturbed LMC disk material, with radial and vertical velocities along its length, which are very significantly disturbed from equilibrium. A comparison with some new simple models suggests that recent interactions with the SMC likely do not strongly affect the feature, although earlier interactions with the SMC may in fact play a role in producing the strongly negative radial velocity along the arm, with the LMC's infall to the Milky Way potential responsible for an increasingly positive vertical velocity along the arm. And I'll say this is really just the start for majors, so please do look out for more exciting results from the majors team on various other features around the LMC and SMC in the near future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lara. I'll pass over to Anisha.
Are there any questions? No.
I can ask a question. I was curious about how reliable the Gaia proper motions are at that distance.
So they've actually improved quite a bit. In Gaia DR2, they had quite large uncertainties, but EDR3's made a big difference actually. So we're pretty confident, and because the motions that I've shown, like one for each field, that's averaging over, sure, that one field only had 13 stars, but most of the others have on the order of 100 Magellanic stars. So averaging over those, we think those are pretty robust.
That was actually another question I had, which was how many stars are you guessing in a field? Because yeah, the target density isn't going to be necessarily high.
No, that's right. So for some of our fields, it is 300 stars where we've used either Gaia EDR2 or EDR3, and they're in the disk. Those can be quite large. In some of the substructures, yes, it is a fair bit less than that, maybe 100, maybe 80 if we're lucky. And then some of the very early fields, because we started this pre-Gaia DR2, this whole survey, some of those have a lot less, just because the only thing you're selecting on is CMD position. And it turns out when you do that, you get a fair bit of Milky Way contamination, unfortunately. So it varies is the answer.
Okay, we have a question on chat. They are asking, well, great talk. And if they're asking if the arm-like feature on the north is influenced by the LMC's infall, does it provide an opportunity to provide additional constraints on the orbit?
On the orbit, it's a little hard to tell, if only because if I flick back, hang on a second. Oh, if I can find the one where I have the kinematics. Here we go. At least in the Z direction, at least, we find, regardless of sort of what you're changing, if you're changing like the orbit, or so the uncertainties in the orbit is basically parameterized by the error bars. And unfortunately, we find both within those and sort of varying, the LMC and SMC masses by a factor of like 5 or 10, you are still producing things that look roughly the same. So it's a very weaker constraint, maybe not a very strong constraint.
All right. I hope that answers. They said thanks. And we have another question. The mean metallicity in even your innermost field is about 0.5 dex higher than the nominal mean present-day LMC metallicity in the inner parts, or even going back a few gigayear. Are these very old stars, or what makes them so metapoor?
Yes, so this is exactly right. They are quite old. Now, we can't precisely date the stars, but when we look at, say, really deep decam photometry, at least in sort of the vicinity of this northern arm, we find, looking at the main sequence turn-off now, there's actually no evidence for any young populations. You're basically looking at really old turn-off stars, so about 11 gigayears, which is what we're saying is then also roughly the age of these red clump stars as well. So yes, they're old, and so they're quite metal poor. And there are actually radial metallicity gradients in the LMC. So it's not totally unexpected that the sort of canonical 0.5 dex in the center, by the time you get out to 10, 12, 20 degrees out, has then decreased to about Fe on H of -1.
I hope that answers the question. Are there any questions from the audience?
Can I ask one quick question?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, when you show the closest SMC approaches as a function of LMC particles, is that indicating the impact or close encounter happens in the southwest part of the LMC disk, or it's just the viewing angle perspective effect that the northeast part has the largest distances compared to the southwest?
Yes, so this is a good question. So yes, in terms of the recent pericenter, yes, that does in fact occur in the southwest, although only just. This is like future paper stuff now, but when you look at like the position of that, it's very close to the LMC center, like in terms of like a radial projection, if slightly to the southwest. Actually, most of that pericentric distance is out of plane distance. So it's close to what would be a direct hit with the LMC in the southwest, just not quite in the plane of the disk. And the crossing itself actually occurs in the northwest. Yes, basically where the arm is now, but 400 million years ago. And so because of it's been, almost half a gig year since then, all of that stuff rotates around to hit in the west.
Thanks.
But the caveat on that is these are simple models, and so don't,
Okay.
Thank
Thank you.